today's World Insight, the future of the US dollar after Washington's policy of using it as a tool for economic war. What are the repercussions and unintended consequences of broad currency-based sanctions? Here's our host, Tian Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight. I'm Tian Wei. The U.S. Treasury said on Monday it would no longer allow Russia to make any dollar debt payments using U.S. bank accounts in a move meant to eat into Russia's dollar holdings. As the U.S. carries out sanctions by weaponizing the dollar, some say it could hasten a move by some countries to reduce their reliance on the U.S. currency. Last week, Russian President Vladimir Putin signed an order requiring international buyers to pay for Russian gas in rubles from April the 1st, or supplies will be halted. European countries heavily reliant on Russian gas for their energy needs are split on whether to sanction Russia's energy sector now. Could there be a breather for Russia amid the crushing sanctions? And will weaponizing the U.S. dollar, some say, eventually backfire? For deeper insights, let's loop in my very strong panel. For more on what some call the financial war amid the Ukraine crisis, we are joined in Seoul, Jim Rogers, world-renowned investor, chairman at the Rogers Holdings. Good to see you, Jim.
I'm delighted.
In Moscow, Dmitry Barbich, who is the political analyst from Sputnik International News Agency. Good to see you, Mr. Barbich. Mm-hmm. In Beijing, Michael Powers, Zurich Insurance Group chair and also professor of the Department of Finance from School of Economics and Management with Tsinghua University. Thank you. Last but not least, in Shanghai, Professor Qian Jun, Executive Dean of the Fanhai International School of Finance with Fudan University. We have a very strong panel today. But let me ask Mr. Rogers, what do you make of the fate of the dollar this time, particularly during the sanctions and the Ukraine-Russia crisis?
Well, throughout history, no currency has been the number one currency for more than 100 years or so. They always change, and I don't like saying it. I'm an American, but I'm afraid America has a problem with the largest debtor nation in the history of the world, and many people are trying to find replacements for the dollar because we keep saying if we don't like you, we put sanctions. And people are saying, no, that's not the way the currency is supposed to work. It's supposed to be neutral. So it is accelerating the move away from the U.S. dollar. Not this month, not this year, but it is accelerating the move away.
Within 100 years, you say?
No, much less than 100 years, 10 years less, probably in the next decade. People are already moving away from the U.S. dollar.
Mr. Barbich, tell me more about how Russia is trying to cope with the sovereign debt issue when it cannot be paid in ruble, and when, of course, you cannot use your foreign exchange in, for example, the banks around the world. How is your economy trying to hold on? What do you make of the fate of the dollar right now?
Well, the balance of payments in Russia before the war started in February this year was very good. I mean, you can check all the statistics. So we were in a pretty good starting position. And the big problem emerged when the United States and the EU started imposing sanctions on banks, those that were not yet under the sanctions. Let me remind you that a lot of sanctions had been imposed before the new crisis in Ukraine. So basically, we have a problem now with paying our foreign debts because the very nations to whom we owe this money, they have frozen our accounts, and they, the United States, for example, refuses to process the payment of debts from Russia. So the whole idea of requiring foreign partners to buy Russian oil and gas for rubles is to make them basically use the system that leaves this money under our control.
You are saying Russia is going to be able to not have a sovereign debt default, even when it's being paid in dollars?
Well, unless the United States default on their payments to Russia, which means if they keep freezing $300 billion of Russian central bank money, and basically this is a default. When you don't return the money that was lent to you, it's a default.
Yeah.
So unless the United States completely defaults on its debt, Russia will not default on its debt.
Okay. Professor Qian Jun, China's RMB, of course, is getting ever popular in the Asia-Pacific region and also among developing emerging economies. But, you know, standing where you are, what do you make of the fate of dollar now?
You know, so I think, as Mr. Rogers said, this has been a problem for the dollar because, on the one hand, it is still, I think it's still the reserve currency of the world. But on any time when you weaponize the dollar, and this has happened before, it is a problem. And recently, what we're hearing is that countries like Saudi Arabia is considering that to price some of its oil they sell to China in RMB. You know, that's going to be an interesting move because if they do that, I think there will be more OPEC countries following suit. From a finance point of view, that's a good move for Saudi Arabia because they want to diversify their holdings of dollar assets. And because China is the largest trading partner with Saudi Arabia, as with a lot of other countries, if they price the oil they sell to China in RMB, it's actually very convenient for them to then take the RMB and buy imported goods and services from China.
Right.
So, but at the same time, the main problem is that there isn't one or two substitute for the dollar, right? So the euro is a possibility, but so I actually think within the next 20 years, what you will see is the dominance of the dollar will become weakened, but you won't be able to see a single alternative currency arises on par with the dollar. So this is why a lot of scholars say what we'll see is like a multilateral system of the global currency, which actually produces more uncertainty for a lot of people.
So what you're saying is that despite of what you call the interesting moves coming from different countries individually or bilaterally, dollar is not likely to be weakened in terms of its position as one of the most powerful currency in our world. Now, Professor Powers, do you agree with that?
I agree with much of what Professor Qian has just said. I think that, and also with what Jim Rogers said earlier, I think that the dollar will remain a dominant currency in world trade for some time to come. But I think that it perhaps its day of preeminence has passed or soon will pass. What will replace it is not a single currency in the way that, for example, the dollar replaced the British pound, but rather, as Professor Chen said, a mixture of currencies. We live in a multipolar world, and there are many, many strong nations, and it certainly would make sense for much trade to be transacted in dollars, euros, renminbi, and other currencies. And so I think that and with the technology that's available, this becomes even more feasible. We also talk about digital currencies. And I suspect that the nation that really gets out in front with digital currencies will also have some advantages in terms of grabbing a market share of that currency tablet.
If we are quite clear about where the dollar is today, let's talk about what about this dollar war apparently against the ruble and against a economy like that of Russia. Let's just put aside the war between Russia and Ukraine, because that is a whole lot of issues within it which we could spend time on. Let's just talk about the currency itself, about with an economy, the currency itself with another currency in our world. Now, Mr. Rogers, you've been traveling to Russia and to surrounding areas in the world for quite some time. Tell me more about whether you are worried that ruble will having tremendous difficulties for years to come, and what about the Russian economy under the pressure of US dollars related sanctions?
Well, years to come, I doubt it. I don't think this war is going to last years to come. But the ruble, it's not a great currency, but Russia doesn't have as much debt as many other countries. I mean, the U.S. is the largest debtor nation in world history. So I would not think that I know the ruble is not going to replace the U.S. dollar. My normal thought would be that the renminbi would, but the renminbi is not a convertible currency. And you cannot have a world currency that's not convertible. I mean, if I want to buy euros, I go on my computer and 10 seconds later, I own euros. You cannot do that with the ruble, and that's with the renminbi, and that's a big problem.
What about the Russian economy itself, Mr. Rogers?
Well,
I mean, you as an investor travel around the world. You have also been studying investment opportunities in Russia, of course. Tell me more about that.
Well, I would like to be investing in Russia right now. I have learned in my experience when there's a war, you usually should buy. But of course, I cannot buy now because the markets are closed and it's illegal for Americans to invest. Normally, I would like to invest in a country which is at war, unless it's going to disappear. But I cannot at the moment. But Russia has vast resources, huge natural resources, and it doesn't have a lot of debt. Now, this war may change all of that, but normally I would like to be investing in Russia now. Investing during a war is often good if you can survive.
Natural gas and natural resources, of course, is a big part of Russia's exports to the European continent, Mr. Rogers. And now there are different opinions within the European continent about what to do, whether to buy rubles in order to purchase the natural gas. Germany, Austria, for example, they have their different opinions compared to the rest of the continent, some say. So, Mr. Rogers, do you see this kind of debate will go on for some time, or national interests and pragmatic interests will drive the discussion?
Pragmatic interest will come out in the end.
Yeah.
People may say it's because of patriotism or something else, but pragmatic interests win in the end. And the Austrians and the Germans need natural gas, and they got to get it somewhere. So buying rubles will be cheap for them and efficient. They may say other things, but national interests are the most important.
Always there's a logic behind everything. Professor Powers, your thoughts?
I generally agree with that, although I'm not 100% sure that Russia will be completely effective in its demand that countries like Germany or Austria pay for their natural gas in rubles. I think that there will be some give and take, some back and forth over time.
Like all the things.
I also think that it isn't clear that that Russia wins in one outcome and loses in the other, because if Russia is asking for payment in rubles, well, it certainly gets rubles, and those countries have to go out and they have to buy rubles, and that pushes up the ruble. On the other hand, if they buy if they pay for it in U.S. dollars or some other currency, then Russia has that currency which you can use to make payments on various debt, which cannot be made in rubles. So I think that there are some advantages and disadvantages to the two alternatives, but I don't think that we should get bogged down into thinking that this is really a definitive or dispositive event in the sequence that will be following in this conflict.
Mr. Barbich, go to you, of course, about Russia's perspective. Under the current circumstances, what are some of the, I know you are a news analyst and not a financier, but what are some of the options that Russia has?
Well, let me first tell you the facts. In the beginning, there was a certain drop in the value of ruble, and Mr. Biden was very happy to announce it. But right now, the ruble basically returned to the same rate it had before February 24th. The foreign companies, which declared very openly that they were leaving Russia, they didn't sell the real estate. The buildings are there. People working at that companies continue to receive their salaries. So there is a widespread expectation in Russia that these companies will come back, or maybe that they not even have left, because when you leave, you sell everything, right? You want to get into cash, as the entrepreneurs say. Almost none of these companies got into cash. Part of the reason is what you said. Right now, it's very difficult to send money from Russia to Washington. But I think the foreign companies would find a way to do it. So I don't buy this argument that this is just because of these technical problems. Speaking about the perspective, I generally agree with everything Jim Rogers said. Just when he said nobody lends money to communists, it reminds me of my early time of working with Chicago Tribune in Moscow with their bureau in the early 90s. The correspondent with whom I worked said, communists are okay, stability is important. Well, first, Russia is not a communist country. And the second, if there is stability, like in China, people will lend, even if officially the government is called communist. Nobody trusts the Russians. I would not say so, because investments continue. They just don't come from Western countries directly. Suddenly, Cyprus started investing a lot more. And Cyprus, as you know, is the usual front for Eastern companies and for Russians themselves to invest in Russia as foreign investors. And the general mood in Russia is not pessimistic. People say that we'll live a different life. Here I agree with Michael Powers that basically it's not going to be back to square one. Life will be different. But this life will not necessarily be worse than the one we're having now. And this is not just the mood of the population. This is the mood of the entrepreneurs. I mean, I think the big mistake that the EU and the United States made was just sanctioning almost 100 of Russia's high officials and Russia's businessmen, including some very pro-Western ones. So they kind of left their hopes before this current crisis started.
I see.
And that's why the strikes which are made now by Western countries, they basically fall flat very often, because these people expected this. They had prepared themselves for this, and they're not surprised, unfortunately.
Let me move on to Professor Qian. First of all, some were suggesting that if the West is not dealing with Russia in business more frequently than they used to, then China will take the place. Now, Professor Qian, tell me about what is, the general thoughts of intellectuals and business people like you thinking about the potential, the risks, and also the advantages.
So certainly there's a lot of talk about Chinese companies, financial institutions that may be involved. They might be affected indirectly, right? And that is a very real risk. As the U.S. government has already said, they have a list of people that you cannot do business with, and they find out that some other individual or companies are doing business with the people on the list, they will be punished as well. So this is what we call the secondary sanctions, right? So I think that type of sanctions is realistic for some Chinese companies and institutions. And frankly speaking, because being part of the global system, and we discussed this already, even though the dollar might have lost some of its dominance over the last 20 years, but it remains the international monetary system and the trade system remains a very much dollar denominated and dominating system. And for China, the Chinese economy and the Chinese companies are very much integrated with many parts of the world, including with the U.S. So, so at some level, I do worry about secondary sanction risk for individual Chinese companies, but I'm not that worried that as a country, China will be involved because, again, I don't think it's right for any government to seize dollar assets especially of another central bank. I don't think that's right. But we talked about Mr. Rogers said that the U.S. is the largest country with the largest amount of debt in dollar. China happens to be one of the largest or the largest holder of the debt, right? So some people are even worried about whether China should be concerned about the U.S. debt it holds. I don't think that's going to be an issue, right? Because given the importance of the Chinese economy, especially how integrated the Chinese economy and the U.S. economy. So I think that's the risk. Of course, there's also risks arising from the crisis. For example, energy prices is out of control, and that has a large what we call spillover effect in the inflation in the world. Many countries are battling inflation, and that might become a very big problem in the U.S., in Europe, and many other countries. On the opportunity side, if you're an OPEC country, if you are a other developing country, you got to think about your safety in using the global financial system. You got to worry about the safety of your overseas assets. And in that regard, I think the RMB does have some opportunity as a trade currency. I think I agree with Mr. Rogers on the convertibility of the RMB to become a reserve currency. But for example, these ASEAN countries, they have a lot of trade with China. I think it's possible that RMB can become a more prominent currency in the settlement of the bilateral trade between China and these countries.
Okay. The Russia-Ukraine crisis, as big as it is, could be one of the symptoms of what we have been going through or what we are likely to go through in the near future. There is a tremendous change to this multipolar world, and the rules of the multipolar world is not clear. So what we are seeing is only the very beginning of this ever-changing time. What advice would you give to investors and businesses who are trying to make their ends meet and also trying to do business as usual, quote unquote?
Well, that's a very tall order.
I know it is. But don't worry. We'll tell everybody, don't just use your advice to buy stocks, okay? So
I'll refer to something a piece of advice from my father. Versatility, flexibility is a very big component of success, being able to adjust to circumstances. Certainly, the world is changing. One has to keep attention to events as they occur, and to try to get the best evidence, the really deep insights into what's going on. And this is becoming more and more difficult because there are so many diverse sources of information, and they all have their own individual biases. And that means that you need to read more of them. You need to absorb information from a greater variety of sources. I would look at things that will have, certainly would be sustainable, or that have clear long-term benefits.
Okay.
The population of the world is aging. Obviously, healthcare medicine is important. Unfortunately, wars continue, so that we're undoubtedly the defense production sector will continue to profit. But I think what's most important is not to be caught by surprise.
I see. Thank you so much. Mr. Barbich.
Well, I would advise the investors to read the newspapers, and not just the business section. Read also the political section, because there are so many risks politically today. And I would give a simple advice. When in a certain country, in the newspapers, you see too often the words like oligarchs, authoritarians, regime change, things like that, avoid that country, because it will impose sanctions on personalities. And I think this is a rule. Antagonizing one CEO is sometimes more harmful than antagonizing 2,000 employees. And it is exactly this kind of ideological attitude that brought us to this situation.
Okay.
And in order to get rid of it, we'll need to be pragmatic, peaceful, and then I hope we will return to the times when we will be able to concentrate on the business section instead of the political section. Right now, it's my advice to the investors: see what the policy of that or other country is, see what is the attitude to it of the collective West.
Okay. Professor Chen.
As a researcher, you will see that when these type of risks, especially unknown risks, spike up, it's not surprising that many firms and investors they hold on to cash. They don't want to make a long-term move, right? So, and that certainly has affected global financial markets lately. On the other hand, out of the last few months, you still see human beings agree on a lot of things, right? So I think it's important to know that there are enough areas to work with that are of common interest to the majority of countries and people on this planet, and those are the areas that's going to be good for many decades.
I see.
And finally, to use a Chinese phrase, right? So the Chinese idiom for the Chinese character of danger and opportunity are always combined together, right? When there is danger, when there's risk, there is also opportunities.
You already know, Professor Chen, that quote is used by Jim. So you stole his quote, so Jim, please now, what is your final thoughts?
Well, I think everybody should watch CGTN to find out what's going on in the world.
Yeah.
Because the next bear market we have is going to be the worst in my lifetime. We had a bad problem 2008 because of debt. Since then, the debt has skyrocketed everywhere. So the next bear market is going to be horrible, and people should be very, very knowledgeable and prepared for bad times. What's happening in Russia now is just a foretaste of what's coming. Be very worried, get prepared, and then you will survive.
Well, it's certainly an encouragement from investors like you guys for the network that I work with, but certainly to be more informed by different sources would always help to all of us when it comes to what is really going on in the rest of the world or in the rest of our neighborhood. Thank you so much for being with us. And that's all the time we have for today. If you'd like to know more, search World Insight or check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on Twitter and Facebook. I'm Tian Wei. On behalf of my team, thanks for being with us. Bye for now.